Well, it's always hard to introduce somebody who needs no introduction, but for those of you who would like to know a little bit more, Dr. Raven is the President Emeritus of the Missouri Botanic Garden, where which he led for 40 years, really turning it into one of the world's leading centers for plant science, conservation, education. Really an amazing place. If it's an Academy of Sciences, he's probably a member. Everything from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences to the Chinese and Russian, Argentinian, more than a dozen of them. Served as Home Secretary for, I think, over a decade for the National Academy of Sciences. Served on President Clinton's Scientific Advisory Committee. Really everywhere, respected around the world for his considerable knowledge of the plant sciences and his real support of conservation and moving everybody forward in this. If it's a medal that had to do with taxonomy or plant sciences, Scott Medal, Engler Medal, U.S. National Medal of Sciences, International Cosmos Prize, was named Time's Hero of the Planet. What happens when you run out of medals and awards to give somebody, they start naming them after you, and the American Society of Plant Taxonomists established the Peter Raven Award in his honor. And I want to read this: to be conferred to authors with outstanding contributions to plant taxonomy, which there are a lot of people like that, and I quote this, for exceptional efforts at outreach to non-scientists. And that's a really important part of that. Dr. Raven has always been very accessible in terms of bringing this hardcore science and conservation and coevolution over the part of his career and bringing it to non-scientists and getting them to understand the importance of what he's doing. So without further ado, Dr. Raven.
Well, it's a really huge pleasure to be here. I have to clear my throat so I can speak, though. But I do feel that you're all having too much fun. I feel like I'm kind of rooted here in Raleigh because Pat's grandmother, for example, went to Emeritus when it was downtown and used to ride on 7 horses abreast down Fayetteville in the 1920s. I mean, they were really little Dickens, no doubt about it. And Pat has carried on that tradition very well. Her family, her father's family, has been in North Carolina for about 300 years, so they are deeply rooted here, and it is a fantastic state, and this is one fantastic place that I've always admired from a variety of points of view. Being a plant geneticist and cytogeneticist and all, I've always recognized Raleigh as a leading place. One fact that I want to give you before I start, did you know that Rolla, Missouri is named after Raleigh? It's it was settled by people from Raleigh, and they went there and they didn't really know how to spell it, so it came out Rolla. My favorite story, it's true. My favorite, this one actually is true, unlike the rest of them. My favorite story about that, I said from somebody from here when they were in Missouri, I said, did you know that Rolla, Missouri is named after Raleigh? And she said, that's ridiculous. We don't pronounce it that way. We pronounce it Rolla. It was kind of funny. It's, I always wondered, I'm a native of San Francisco, and I always wondered if there was a special way so that you could recognize people from there. And the way I just identified is, if you're a native, you call it San Francisco, which is sort of S-A-M-P-X-K-O. You couldn't possibly say San Francisco over and over again. Anyway, this is a fantastic place, and Pat and I are delighted to be here. We celebrate, and I particularly celebrate, the intimate relationship between plants and people. These hands are from a Garifuna person who's living on the coast of Honduras. But they indicate, when you see the weaving there, I've always thought this slide, this image which Pat took, illustrates so well the loving, intimate relationship between plants and people. If anybody appreciated the intimate relationship between plants and people, it was, of course, J.C. Ralston. He arrived here in 1975 at the age of 35, and during the next 21 years literally transformed the whole program here, founded the Arboretum, charged up people in North Carolina and in the whole nursery industry here with a love of nursery plants, and enriched it, built this wonderful Arboretum that later was named in his honor. He started in 1976. My wife, Pat, came here as a student in horticulture in 1977 and got her master's degree in 79 with Dr. Ralston co-chairing her committee. I don't need to tell you that this Arboretum, being of really relatively recent origin, 1976 to now, is a real treasure house of plant diversity, and particularly of the diversity of cultivated plants, which is what Dr. Ralston would have loved. And it has enlivened and enriched the whole understanding of plants, the appreciation of nature, and particularly the nursery and plant-related industries here in North Carolina for very many years. It's like most botanical gardens, it's a beautiful place to be and a beautiful place to walk around and enjoy. But in addition to that, it contains a really remarkable and precious collection of cultivated plants. Now, my favorite graduate of this place is my wife. Yes. This is a picture of her in Bhutan, where we were just recently. I know that Tony Avon and many other wonderful people were graduates in that era, but as far as I'm concerned, she's the best. She took many of the images in this presentation that I'm making to you, and I think you'll appreciate them as we go along. It's wonderful that this Arboretum was named after J.C. It's incredibly sad that he died, of course, in a car crash at the age of 56 when he was just burning with a white-hot heat about plants in cultivation and all the rest, and inspiring so many people. But so be it. It's not really how long you live or so forth. It's what you do with the years that you have, and he certainly did more than most mortal human beings to inspire people about the objectives of this Arboretum and made it the lovely place that it is today, and wonderfully appropriate, obviously, that it's named after him. Now, what I want to talk about today, though, is the world, and I want to talk about what's affecting the world in which the Arboretum exists, what the Arboretum symbolizes in that world, where we're going, and what we can do about perhaps not going there. Human beings have been on the earth for about 2.3 billion years, but our numbers remained relatively low until about 12,000 years ago. After 2.3 million years, about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, there were only about 1 million human beings in the whole world, which is kind of amazing in view of the figures that I'm about to discuss with you. Those people lived in small groups of about 30 to 60 people, going around hunting and gathering, getting plant foods, getting animals, storing them, eating them, and so forth, and rarely encountering other groups. The population of Europe about 12,000 years ago is estimated at about 100,000. As I say, the population of the world at about 1 million. By 10,000 years ago, people had brought domesticated plants to the point where they were a mainstay of their diet throughout the world, and as they began to cultivate more and more of the earth, the whole character of the earth began to change, and human numbers began to swell. When people began to live in villages, towns, cities, they could, being concentrated together, specialize in various professions, like music, like poetry, like law, civic and religious leaders, farmers, and all the rest. And as you can see, if they were existing in groups of only 30 to 60 people and wandering around and all depending for their survival on being able to gather enough food each day to make it possible for them to go on living, they couldn't possibly specialize in ways that would have made all the things that we now consider civilization possible. Writing was invented about 5,000 years ago. It was invented first in Babylonia, Syria, in other words, about where Iraq is now, cuneiform writing, and it was invented in Egypt about simultaneously hieroglyphic writing. But the hieroglyphic writing invented in Egypt spread only a little bit up and down the Nile, and the cuneiform writing was developed into the kinds of alphabets that we have now, that we use in our modern writing. Chinese writing was developed about 500 years later, obviously completely independently, and the first examples we have are from about 4,500 years ago. Importantly, in reviewing the history of the earth, anything that happened within the last 5,000 years may be written down and may be preserved, and anything that happened before that will be remembered, will be thought about as something that occurred in the past, may be passed on as stories and songs and so forth, but will not be written down directly. So that's kind of why our literature presents the world as it is. Now, world population growth has been amazing, starting with about those are billions on the left, starting with about 1 million people only 10,000 years ago. As you can see, it had climbed to only about 300 million people 500 years ago, sort of medieval Renaissance times. And when Thomas Malthus, the English clergyman who said that population growth in human beings was going to soon outstrip our ability to produce food, and we're all going to starve and help, the sky is falling and all. It was the 1790s, and there were not even 1 billion people in the whole world, which was, in other words, only about 2/3 as many people as are in either China or India at the present time were the population of the whole world in the 1790s. Malthus was not as correct as he might have been because of the Industrial Revolution. People learned how to move water from one place to another, how to fertilize with artificial fertilizer that could be manufactured, how to plow better with engines and so forth, and their agricultural productivity went up. But if you look at this map, you can see, for example, that when the Land Grant Act was passed, we're about here in the progression. When J.C. Ralston came to NC State, we were about here in the progression. When I was born in 1936, we were about down here. And you can see that in the lifetimes of most people who are alive at the present day, human population has grown has ripped through 2 billion people after growing from 1804 to 1927 to get to that point. 23 years later, there were, 33 years later, there were 3 billion people. 14 years after that, there were 4 billion people, and so forth. The fastest rate of population growth in percentages was in 1971, about here, when they're about, the population was growing by nearly 3% per year, and that's when Paul Ehrlich got worried about population. A lot of people got worried about population. Family size went down around the world for reasons that I'll talk about in part as we go on. but the base is so much higher that the population continues to explode upward, as you can see here, to after another 12 years, 1999, another billion people. After another 12 years, 5 billion people, and on upward. It is slowing down because we're not getting the high percentages per year that we did once, but on the other hand, it's still growing very rapidly, and that's a matter of considerable concern. A basic problem, of course, in humans' effect on the environment is population. The more people there are, no matter what they're consuming, the more damage will be done to the earth. And if you think about it, agriculture is spread over the earth starting about 10,000 years ago, and at the present time, about 40% of the Earth's ice-free surface is devoted to agriculture. If you want to think about extinction of biological diversity, which we'll be getting to presently, and think about the fact that crop agriculture is about 14% of the ice-free surface of the world, or 11% of the land surface of the world, and that grazing exists on about twice that much land, then you can realize, then you think about damage to the environment or damage to biodiversity or extinction, and you really can realize that, barring anything else, agriculture is one of the very worst enemies of biodiversity that you could possibly imagine. You can't use up all of that land without damaging the life on Earth, simultaneously. This is a picture that illustrates population very well. Obviously, it's an amalgamation of satellite pictures at night showing where the illumination by human lights lies in that picture, and you get a real view there of where dense populations are and therefore what they must mean. Population, though, is by far from being the only factor involved in this. Population is one factor, but affluence, or amount of consumption per person, is a very important multiplier. And then technology, the kind of technology that we use, is another very important factor. And it's really the product of those three that cause the problems that we have. Here is what a European, a German family in this case, with 2 children would eat in a normal week. And as you can see, the food goes from back there all around here to here, okay? And that's about what people would eat in the United States in a week. And they don't look particularly chubby. So it's a pretty normal diet. How do you suppose the picture would look in Western Africa that compared with that? Well, here's what it looks like. Here's a family with 3 children in Western Africa, in the area that's fighting Ebola right now, and the amount of food they eat in a week would be in those 3 sacks plus these, and that's it. So obviously, the one family will have much more impact on the earth than the other family, and the one family may or may not be getting sufficient nutrition. Then you have pollution. Technologies that were very good early in the Industrial Revolution and really supported people and brought them to new heights, when spread widely over the world with an ever rapidly increasing and demanding population, suddenly began to be damaging in themselves. And one of the things that we have in the equation, therefore, is technology, what we use, how we use it, and so forth. Now, the Global Footprint Network, a think tank in Oakland, California, attempts to calculate impacts on the Earth's sustainable capacity. And in doing that, they compare biocapacity, which is how much bioproductive area is available to people, with the ecological footprint, which is how much area do we demand. And you can calculate that for the whole world or for individual nations or counties or families or universities or whatever you want. And one of the things that I would really encourage you to do, if you aren't already familiar with it, what? Isn't this doing it? Ah. Let me adjust myself a little here. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's good.
Sorry. Ecological footprint, as they calculate it, is a composite of the various factors shown there as a large footprint, forest land, carbon footprint, grazing land, urban land, fishing, pollution, absorption, and all the other things that go along with it. Now, one of the ways you can look at it is to say for individual countries, how much do they use and how much do they have? And this is a 1961 map projected onto 2005 country boundaries to make it congruent with the next map that I'm going to show you. And the darker brown a country is there, the more it exceeds its own productive capacity. And the darker green it is there, the more it exceeds the debt. I mean, the more capacity it has. The lighter green it gets, the greater the debt per person for the individual country. So there's the picture in 1961. Look at North America, China, Europe, India there. And now look at them in 2005. That's a very short space of time. That's only 44 years, and as you can see, a lot of the world in those 44 years, while the population and demand were shooting upward, a lot of the world was converted from compensating well for itself to having to import, going far beyond its own capacity. One of the things we can do to illustrate that further is to look at individual countries. And as you can see there, this is Great Britain, which has been a colonial power all of this time. And as you can see there on the left, and you need to remember those numbers in the next two that I'm going to show you also, which are the US and China. In Great Britain, they consume at the rate of, if you project it on the world, 4 to 5 hectares of productive capacity per capita, and the actual amount that they have within their own boundaries is about 1.8 falling to 1 as they sort of overuse that and as their numbers grow over the years. Here's a similar diagram for the United States, and as you can see there in 1960, we were using less than our own productive capacity, but as our numbers have gone up, our ecological footprint has been very high. Notice that the numbers here are in the range of 8 and so forth, much higher than they are in Great Britain, which is down around here. And notice that as our population has grown and our consumption has gone up, our sustainable capacity has been going downward from about 6.5, better than 6.5, down to about 2 hectares per person. And here's the situation in China. Notice that there the numbers are about 1 to 2 hectares per person, the very larger number of people for the productive area of land, and that the lines have crossed in about 1974, which would be sort of towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. And as they cross, population hasn't grown hugely in China during that period because of the one-child policy, but consumption rates have shot way up. So consumption rates have gone from the equivalent of about 1.5 up to the equivalent of about 2.3 hectares per capita, while the biocapacity has sunk from about 1.4 down to about 1.2 hectares per capita. One of the ways you can make this graphic is to, and which Global Footprint Network does, is to calculate Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day when the Earth has reached its capacity to renew. In other words, beyond the Earth Overshoot Day in a given year, we're eating into the ability of the earth to renew itself. We're lowering the strength, the regenerative capacity of the earth. And this year we passed that day on August 19th, which means, calculated, which means that everything that we consume after August 19th is lowering the productive capacity of the earth, collectively. And think about that in relation to the very great differences between nations that I just showed you, and realize how remarkable that really is, and begin to think about what it means for our capacity to build together. The so-called Brunstrom Report, Our Common Future of 1987, which became a UN report, which was adopted as a UN report after it was written, presents a kind of a fantasy land of all nations in the world getting better and better and improving themselves until they can live at the standard of consumption and all that we have in the West. But as you've just seen, there's not in fact enough productive capacity in the world to make that possible, and no means by which it could happen. And here's one way of looking at that diagrammatically. Right now, we're using about 1.5 times the Earth's productive capacity. And while you think about that, let me remind you, because it's very important, that that doesn't mean that if we actually had the productive capacity of another half Earth, to support the 7.3 billion people that are around now, that things would be any better. There would still be in the world, as there are now, some 800 to 900 million people who are malnourished, in other words, whose bodies couldn't develop properly and their brains couldn't develop properly. And there would still be 100 million people on the verge of starvation, roughly, at any given time. So what it does mean is that if you had another half Earth, you'd be able to go on doing that without decreasing the ability of the Earth to recover, with every passing year. But in fact, without making things any better, we're simply decreasing that. And as the students, as the researchers in the Global Footprint Network point out, if we go on with business as usual, you get up to this point where we need 2.3 Earths by 2050, not very long ago, not very long in the future, 36 years. And to get down within the productive capacity of our own Earth and reach stability, we'd have to get on with very, very strenuous new projects. I like to quip at this point that the Earth and a half there, some people talk about let's colonize other planets and so forth. Well, we quasi-calculated, or we facetiously calculated while I was on the faculty at Stanford in the 1960s, that if you use the entire Earth's productive capacity to export people to other planets, all of the money in the world, in other words, would be used just for the purpose of exporting people. You could only export about 12 people a year to the nearest planet that we suspect could support life. And then I always like to say, we all have a list of at least 12 people that we want to but it doesn't go very far towards solving the basic problems that we're talking about. People's interaction with plants and with nature is profound, and it's not strange because we depend so fully and completely on nature in every single imaginable way. The interactions in nature, like this interaction between leafcutter ants in the tropics who are carrying those leaves into their nest, cultivating fungi on them, and using them as their primary food, those interactions which determine and control the flow of energy through natural ecosystems or artificial ecosystems are what really creates the living world into which we evolved and in which we live and which we depend for our support. That living world is essential for our lives. That living world is the context with which we'd have to build global sustainability, and yet we're driving the components of that living world to extinction at an unprecedented rate. And we need to ask ourselves what we could possibly do to reverse that process. Dependent entirely on plants for our food, directly or indirectly. Dependent on the genetic diversity of plants to fight off disease or to enable the plants to grow in the conditions in the future altered by global climate change. It might surprise you to know that 2/3 of the people in the world depend directly on plants for their medicines. They don't depend on drugstores at all, starting with India and China, but also including much of tropical Asia, Latin America, and Africa. They depend entirely on plants for their medicine. And even for those of us who buy products normally from the drugstore, about 25% of them were detected by the effects of plants and then manufactured later. An example of that would be aspirin, which comes from salicylic acid. The Latin name for willow is salix, and aspirin was developed because Europeans were chewing willow bark for headaches and so forth, and then eventually people learned to manufacture it, and on from there. Or vinblastine and vincristine from the rosy periwinkle, which are such effective cures for childhood leukemia, and effective also in some ways for other forms of cancer, which are still grown in plants and taken from the plants and used directly. For those of us who buy prescription drugs, about 1/4 of them are like that, and another 1/4 of them would be made from bacteria and fungi, including most of the 5,000 patented antibiotics that exist in the world now. And then we come to molecular biology. Molecular biology is really only 50 years old itself. Watson and Crick's prediction that DNA might be the genetic material or had a logical structure to be the genetic material was made in 1953, but it wasn't until the 60s that we began to really understand the underlying interactions and develop the modern science of molecular biology. I recently co-organized a symposium in Wuhan, China, and Mark Van Montague, who's one of the first people who developed ways of transferring genes from one kind of organism to another, to a plant, talked about what we know about genetics now. And what we know about genetics now is incredible. Between epigenetics, the methylation of certain elements in the genes, turning them on and off, the meaning of the silent spaces in genes, the stretches of DNA that don't have any obvious genes on them, the various ways that genes are controlled in their action or reversed in their action by details of the structure of the DNA, are things that are just unimaginable 2 years ago that we know about now. But the beat goes on. But the fact is, and I asked Mark about this, I said, does what you just said about genes constitute an argument for wanting to preserve biological diversity? And he said, certainly does, because we don't know how much those processes differ in different kinds of organisms at all. We're just at the edge of learning about it. Now, when I was a junior at the University of California in 1955, I was taught that DNA was a minor constituent of cells of unknown function. And that was essentially a state-of-the-art point of view in 1955, and here we are now. But it's the diversity of organisms that will really enable us to understand those processes and use them for our own benefit. And then, of course, there are ecosystem services, which include just the absolute wonderfulness of nature, the control of flooding, the control, the absorption of pollution, the protection of topsoil, the provision of pollinators, breeding grounds for fishes and crustaceans and all along marine areas, pollination services from communities coming out into croplands and other places, and absolute diversity. And of course, this is the kind of diversity that that this Arboretum prizes when you think about the myriad sources of cultivated plants in the North Temperate region. By the way, that's my daughter Katie, sacked out on the tree there. I just wanted to be proud of her on a recent trip to Bhutan. When you think about the diversity of plants that are still out there, and you think about how few of them are really in cultivation and what potential there is in wild plants for fostering the aims of this Arboretum, you know, which are the aims of society in general, when you think that there are about 240 kinds of magnolia in the world and about 210 of them are threatened or endangered in nature, existing in numbers so low or being hammered so hard that they're in danger of extinction, then you begin to realize that just among many other things, the roots of the activities that are played out here in the Ralston Arboretum are also in nature. And being in nature, nature is where we need to find them. Nature is where we find the basic genetic diversity that enables us to improve them, and as we improve them, to enrich our lives still further. Now, eukaryotes is a fancy sounding name, but what it really means is all living organisms other than bacteria and viruses, organisms with complex cells. My estimate is there are about 12 million of them. And it might surprise you, and that's based on, you know, the ratios between well-known groups like land vertebrates and plants and poorly known groups in, say, tropics and temperate region in different countries in different parts of the world. Which kinds of comparisons allow you to estimate how many there might really be in total? Well, only about 2 million of those 12 million have been given scientific names so far, and about 90% of those we know about nothing. You know, we have one, sometimes we have a little corpse in the bottom of a bottle of formalin in the British Museum, which is collected in an indeterminate locality in the middle of the Amazon basin. So even if you determined that the next one that you had was the same, you wouldn't really be learning anything except you had two of them. And so we know very, very little about the kinds of organisms in the world. And when you cut down tropical forests, something I'll get to in a minute, about 19 out of 20 of the species that you're destroying would never have been registered scientifically and would be completely unknown. And the conclusion of all of that is we really know very little about the organisms on Earth on which we depend 100% and which we're driving to extinction at unprecedented rates. You can estimate extinction rates by looking at organisms with hard bodies like vertebrates that have bones that are preserved, and you can see how long species last and so forth, or mollusks. 65 million years ago was when the dinosaurs bit the dust for the last time, the last surviving dinosaurs at that time. Mammals and modern groups of birds and so forth came into the ascendancy. And if you measure rates of extinction on groups where you can reasonably measure it, then you get about 10 per year for the past 65 million years. And then if you look at the last 500 years, since it was movable type and widespread distribution of books, and you have a real record of it, you know, I don't see such and such butterflies anymore, there are no wolves in Britain or what have you. Then you get about 100 species per million per year, over 1,000. Now there are like 1,000, as I say. The rate may soon reach about 10,000 for reasons that I'm about to run through. And that means, incredibly, that about half of all the species on Earth could be extinct by the end of this century. And if that has any credibility at all, and look up, if you'd like to delve into that further, look up an article of which Stuart Pym at Duke is the senior author, and I'm one of about 12 authors in Science from about 6 months ago that presents all the arguments for thinking of this as a reasonable assumption of the rate of extinction. And that's a very serious thing. What is driving organisms to extinction are a variety of factors, including the destruction of habitats. Remember that I already pointed out that Agriculture over the last 10,000 years has dealt with about 40% of them all and reduced them to things that look like this. Most of the grazing in the world is on natural grasslands, and most of it is unsustainable over the really fairly short term. Here's tropical forests, which house about half of all the organisms on land on Earth. The green ones there are relatively intact, and the red ones are cut. And as you can see, in Asia, it's pretty well gone right now in Madagascar, which has 14,000 species of plants, most found nowhere else, double the number of species in the southeastern United States. Most of the forests are gone, and so it goes. There are still reasonable blocks there, but they're going very rapidly too, as the natural resources of those countries are used both for their own growing populations, but also for the receiving countries around the world, which we've already seen. Sub-Saharan Africa right now, has about 900 million people, and you all know how difficult it is politically and socially and in terms of feeding people and so forth. But that number is growing at about 90,000 net per day, and by the year 2050, which is 36 years from now, the population of sub-Saharan Africa is estimated to be not 900 million, but about 2.2 billion. And think about what putting another 1.3 billion into sub-Saharan Africa will mean in terms of our ability to feed the people, or their ability to feed the people, to reach social order, and all the rest, and you get a view of how serious this all really is. Global warming, which is perfect scientific consensus now, and essentially a consensus from all groups of people in the world by now, although there are still radio commentators and other scientists of that sort who will deny it. Science is not a field in which all voices are equal. One scientist who worked on global warming, global climate change, somebody came up to him and said, "Do you believe in global warming?" He said, "No, I don't believe in it. I reserve belief for important things like religion and moral systems and the like. Global climate change is simply a scientific consensus reached by thousands of independent scientists writing in the peer-reviewed literature, academies of sciences, and other think groups about what's going on in the world. That really has nothing to do with belief." Global surface temperature since the 1850s is like that. The rate of growth is unprecedented. It's shooting upward, and if it goes very far, a lot of the earth will be uninhabitable. The characteristics of agriculture by humans, the characteristics of agriculture will be drastically changed, and we're just now beginning to talk about it seriously. Pat and I went with a group of evangelical Christian leaders and scientists to Shishmaref Island, to Alaska, and then to Shishmaref Island, which is in the Arctic Ocean, which is an island inhabited by about 600 people. It's been inhabited for about 4,000 or 5,000 years, to look at the effects of global climate change, global warming together. And what we found was that the streets of this town of 600 people on this small island in the Arctic Ocean are basically melting down into the ocean as the permafrost melts back towards the center of the island. And at the same time, and we have this all over the western United States, forests are becoming easy food for destructive insects and other organisms that are spreading. And horticultural zones are changing, and anybody who gardens or knows about gardening will understand that. Look at north. Those are the 9 horticultural zones in the United States. Look at this state, North Carolina, in 1990 and in 2006. One of the scandals, or look at anything. Look at Texas and the Gulf Coast going over to Florida, or and so forth, or look at the state of Missouri where we live. Everything is changing, and changing very rapidly. The scandal in all of this is that the USDA had no funds really to spend on making projections after 1990, important as these are for the whole nursery industry, for agriculture, and for everything else. And the Arbor Day Foundation, of all silly things, had to step in and make this. 4 years later, the USDA issued a completely outdated statement that also went back to 2006, and there's no further action on that. The USDA didn't have enough computer capacity to cover this, so they farmed it out to Oregon State University, which is where you get information on horticultural zones at the present time. That, I think, is kind of a scandal in the face of the economic and serious societal importance of that for us all. And of course, drought is spreading by that. Some of that drought is connected to global climate change. Some of it isn't, but it's a very, very serious thing. And whatever causes it, it's a real portent for the future, because rainfall is going up some places, rainfall is going down other places. There will be droughts. The places we grow crops are going to be different in the future from what they are now. And it's something we very definitely have to pay a lot of attention to. The melting of the ice in the Arctic Ocean is highly significant and very obvious. Look on the left-hand side there, the Arctic Ocean above Siberia, to get an idea of that. If all the ice, well, here's an example of how this can interact with extinction. This is a slice of Queensland, the horn that sticks up on the upper right-hand side of Australia, stretching towards New Guinea. And these are mountains on which many relic plants and animals live. There are 76 relic species of vertebrates occurring in the area shown there in red. They're more numerous in the areas that are darker red. And climate change, potential climate change in degrees Celsius is shown along the bottom lines of those graphs. So 1 degree, and watch this and look at the extent of the habitat for the endangered species on the left, and you can see why global climate change is such an important thing for extinction. That's 1 degree beyond the current temperature. That's 2 degrees beyond the current temperature. And you can see the temperature going up in the top graph and the number of species going down in the bottom one, or the amount of core habitat going down in the bottom one. And at 5 degrees above the current temperature, it's like that. And at 7 degrees, which God help us remember seeing, it's like that. There's no core habitat left. That same thing is being repeated all over the world. Sea level rise is another matter. I think this is about a 200 feet elevation right here, is that right? If all of the, something like that, if all of the ice, all of the glaciers and snowpacks in the world were to melt, sea level goes up 185 feet. So you could be on the coast again, but there are certain penalties for the people living east of here, or in Florida or anywhere like that. And sea level rise, that shows it. The red line is measured by satellite, but basically that shows it moving up from 1880 to the present. Vietnam, which is one of the major rice-producing countries in the world, projects that it will lose about 1/3 of its agricultural area before the middle of this century. China has calculated that it's going to lose about 1/3 of its 3 major industrial areas on the coast in that same period of time, and is making provisions to try to project and replace them. Any politician who is stupid enough or willful enough to go on saying that this isn't really happening or we don't need to deal with it ought to be removed from office immediately, because of the huge disservice that they're doing to the people. You know, in the United States, the government is the insurer of coastal lands, and all municipalities along the coast are pushing to build more malls and things going out right to the coast, right into the salt marshes, anywhere else, so they can increase their tax revenues. As the sea level rises, and the generally accepted rise for the remainder of this century might be about 4 feet, as the sea level rises, all those people that our government is insuring will have to pay off, and we're talking about trillions of dollars of extra debt, but we're not really paying attention to that in our calculations. In socialist Great Britain, on the other hand, the insurers are all private, and they're all flourishing and healthy, and the government plays a role mainly in discouraging people from building in areas that are going to be flooded through zoning and other provisions. It's something we really need to think seriously about. If it all melts, it looks about like this. That's pretty serious. If you want to buy real estate in Florida, you probably ought to think very seriously about it and calculate how fast governments can begin to take over and recover the situation there. And as I say, in North Carolina, you can all look forward to a life on the beach. Invasive aliens are another kind of problem. This is Mycania in Taiwan. You can see that it's doing a pretty good job on the native vegetation there. Zebra mussels are well known. January 2000, about 50 years after they were first detected in the United States, that was their range. Malaria was introduced into the New World after Columbus, and you know what effects it has here. So if you think about how to deal with biodiversity, and you know, in looking at the nursery industry and the kind of plants that are here, you're dealing with biodiversity. If that 12 million species is accurate, it would take us about 1,000 years to find and name the rest. And of course, we haven't got that kind of time. Plants with about 380,000 named species and probably another 75,000 yet to be detected are going extinct much faster than they are being detected. So over half of all the species may disappear during this century. So what can we do about it? Well, if you say what can you do about it, and you mean that on a narrow basis, that is, what can you do about it when dealing directly with the biodiversity, you can have arboretums, you can have nature reserves, you can learn what's out there, you can have modern methods of disseminating information. You can involve people locally in the effort so that everybody will feel they have a stake in the biodiversity around them. And especially for plants, you can do what's called ex situ, away from the place conservation, which would be like in botanical gardens or seed banks. So some examples. These are Peruvian students and foresters being instructed in a program of the Missouri Botanical Garden as to how to inventory the plants in their forests and protected area. This is the editorial committee for the Flora of China on Wangshan, a beautiful yellow mountain in China that was a wonderful place for us to be and to meet. And these are the people, the joint Chinese and foreign committee that made the completion of the Flora of China over 25 years in 49 volumes and completely online possible, 31,500 species. That's an example of improving the knowledge base about the plants of China, which in turn enables you to think harder about their conservation, however you're going to do it. Electronics now gives us great opportunities to look at pictures and other information about plants in a very easy way that can be accessible all over the world. The application of molecular biology to the understanding of organisms gives us very rapid indices to their variability and will indicate more and more clearly as the methods for looking at that speed up to act effectively in terms of their conservation and to understand their relationships better than we ever have before. Also to do things like this combined with GIS, that's mesquite in South America, where it's native, and on the right is mesquite in Pakistan and India and neighboring countries where it's introduced. And that's a model on the left showing you where mesquite can spread and be a serious weed in those countries. the protection of areas, particularly areas that have altitudinal gradients and so will be effective in times of climate change, is very important. Protection of CRP lands in the United States is a very important strategy, for example, for preserving biological diversity. More and more people are thinking seriously about cities, urban areas, and what kind of biodiversity is in them. And of course, one advantage of thinking about that is that's close to many people. And if you have biodiversity in cities and urban areas, kids and adults and other people can become involved with it in ways that they couldn't otherwise. Bringing plants into cultivation, as is done here, is de facto a very important way of preserving them. And a lot of plants that nobody would have thought was important to try to preserve can be preserved or have been preserved in this way by bringing them into cultivation. The most well-known example, of course, being Franklinia, which was discovered by the Bartrams around 1800 and last seen in 1810 in nature, but is represented by hundreds of thousands or probably millions of individuals in cultivation. And of course, ginkgo barely survives in a native state, but again, or metasequoia, dawn redwoods, have about 6,000 wild individuals and millions of trees all over the temperate regions of the world now. Propagating these plants and learning how to set them back out into nature in places where they can survive, which is dicey in the face of climate change, but still worth trying to do and learning the principles of, because that's the way in which we'll have to reform communities in nature, is an important part of the process, as is storing plants in seed banks like this Millennium Seed Bank of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, which has about 60,000 species of plants with seeds stored in it under appropriate conditions where they may last hundreds of years, and provides a kind of a life raft for survival in a rapidly changing world. We should never make a mistake about how rapidly the world is changing right now or how much that means to us, because in fact, we're living in a time when more organisms may become extinct and the character of the world may be changed more rapidly than it has been at any recent time, or hopefully than it ever will be in the future, which means what we do now individually and collectively has a great importance and a great force on the contours of the world in the future. You know, we're used to thinking about the world we're in, and you know, we may say, depending on how cynical or what age we are, that we're going to be gone anyway. We may say we'd like to protect it for our children and grandchildren, but Werner Arbour, a Nobel Prize winner and the head of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences at our recent meeting, said, what we're really talking about is, are we going to create a world in which our civilization can survive for 100 or 200 or a few hundred more years, or even thousands of years, because under the conditions that I outlined in the beginning, it won't, unless we begin to take really serious steps. What are some of the practical things we can do? First and foremost, I think promoting international understanding is incredibly important, because unless we understand nations around the world, we're not going to do anything about them. You know, very few people care very much even about the poor people in their own communities, but you want to talk about hundreds of thousands of people starving to death in X, Y, Z. Are we going to care? Are we going to do something about it? Are we going to try to build a sustainable world with them and reverse this? Keep learning. Arguments in ecology, as in everything else, are worst when they're just people, ignorant people, shouting at one another without having any basis of facts on which they can agree. Remember that science is not something that tells you what you ought to do. It simply tells you what's going on and how that might affect what you do. For example, science doesn't tell you not to jump off a 7-story building at all. It just tells you what might happen if you do, what probably will happen if you do. Science doesn't tell you not to cover the whole world in 10 feet of garbage. It just tells you what might happen if you do. Similarly with global warming, you know, that's one of the problems. Given the facts, when you understand the facts, when you understand the best facts you can, then you have to make political and economic decisions about it. Act on what you know. Stay up to date and act on what you know. Vote and teach other people about it. There are a lot of practical things you can do: sustainable foods, solar panels, hybrid cars, composting. And if you remember how much we consume in the United States, you can realize that on a world scale, each one of those individual actions is far more important than you think and will really make a difference. Around the world, the most important thing that can be done undoubtedly about population is to empower everyone, and particularly to empower women and children. By doing so, by bringing them into our society, we gain huge numbers of educated people who can contribute to the quality of our common future. By excluding them, we condemn billions of people in the world to unhappiness, poverty, malnutrition, and all the other bad things that go along. It's not only a wrong from a moral point of view, it's wrong, it's stupid from an intellectual point of view. If we want the world to be better, we don't start by, in effect, passively or actively disenfranchising half of its people, children, women, and all the rest, and then acting as if the rest of it can figure it out. You know, the motto of the United Negro College Fund, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." If you project that globally, you'd say billions of minds are a terrible thing to waste. They really are. We don't have them. It's not a luxury that we can spend. Educating children is one of the very most important things that you can do, because of course they will carry the ball forward. If we don't change attitudes, we'll find it impossible to save the world in a relatively intact form. Because think about it, is a politician going to run for office on, "I want you to have fewer children"? Is a politician going to run for office on, "I want you to consume less, to eat less, to import less food, to buy cheaper cars, to not use so much energy in heating and cooling your houses"? You know, no way, except there is a way. Earth Day in 1970 had 20 million people going out somewhere and doing something about demonstrating. And in 1970, when we had about 200 million people in the United States, that was 1 out of every 10 people in the country. It's no coincidence that Earth Day in 1970 resulted, the movement that took us to Earth Day, which Senator Gaylord Nelson saw as very important to foster. That movement took us to our key environmental legislation, which was passed in the next few years during the Nixon administration, and has really served as the backbone for protecting our environment ever since. In other words, what we really seem to need in the world is not more tables and figures like I've been giving you today, although they're useful as background, is not only a different kind of economy which doesn't assume that Christmas sales have to grow 5% a year forever in order for people to be happy. What we need is kind of a moral change, a religious change, a spiritual change, a change in the way we view the world collectively, because if enough of us feel differently about it and feel we do want our civilization, we do value poetry, we do value music, we do value other important things about our civilization, and we want them to go on, we've got to stop joking ourselves that we in the United States are in some kind of insulated rowboat and are immune to everything going on in the world, and get down to brass tacks and begin to change and tell other people that you've changed and get together and demonstrate it. And of course, if you do that, the politicians will follow. They cannot lead in this. They couldn't possibly lead in this. They can torque it a little bit, but it's just a basically unpopular thing. People probably motivated by Stone Age eagerness to cloister and grab everything that they can are motivated by acquisition, by acquiring richness, by acquiring stuff, by acquiring jewelry, by acquiring whatever it is, and that is not going to be changed by politicians. That can be changed only by the attitude of people. What part can each and every one of us play in changing that attitude? Should we be optimists or pessimists? The world is clearly going downhill. The world will never be as diverse, as wonderful, as beautiful, and as filled with opportunities as it is on December 4th, 2014. It's clearly a downhill process, limiting diversity, limiting opportunity, limiting beauty, and making the world a less desirable place than it is right now tonight. But how badly is it going to get? How bad is it going to get? Where is it going to come to roost? Because we can't go on expending more than the earth has indefinitely. So how bad is it going to be when this is all over? Well, that depends on what each one of us does. As Gandhi said, the world provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. And somehow we've got to come to understand that, to assimilate it, to incorporate it in ourselves, and to act on it, because I'm convinced that it's only that kind of a moral shift, a shift in our understanding of the context in which we live, and of course many people do get this, but not nearly enough, that will bring the world through it all in a relatively intact condition over the next centuries. So I hope that the remarks that I've made might have some usefulness in helping you to think about this. It's an example of what all important problems are. It's an invitation to think creatively. It's an invitation to accept responsibility. It's an inspiration to be inspirational. It's an invitation to be inspirational. I hope that many of you will have found some kind of inspiration in these words and relationships. I hope you'll understand how everything you do, everything you hope for your children, everything you hope for the world in the future depends on our ability, our common ability, to take those relationships on board, to think about them, and to do something about them. I really appreciate the opportunity of having addressed you this evening, and I'm now going to stop the recording, I think.
I'll take care of that.
What I'm going to do. I better go by the microphone, I guess. So anyway, I'll be delighted to hear any comments or questions or suggestions or anything else you might have.
Question.
Yeah.
Is your lecture available at the TED Talk?
Sorta.
Sort of.
It's available in a derivative of TED called TEDx, which is debate format. But of course, this has been recorded tonight, and it will be available to anybody who wants it. So that might be even more useful for the present audience. Yeah.
Are there a couple of books that have been formative in helping you appreciate how rapidly things are moving in terms of global warming, in terms of
You can find a lot of books that do that easily just by searching topics. It changes continuously. I wouldn't recommend any particular one, but you know, at the level I was talking about, the writings of people like Aldo Leopold and John Muir are really the kind of writings that are going to inspire us to do something about it, rather than continued figures, although the figures are important and informative. The second chapter of Genesis says that man is commanded to save and preserve the earth. You can think about it that way. Or you can think about, if you worry about poor people, if you follow the Bible in that respect, you can think about the fact that anything you do, anything we do in the United States has a far worse effect on poor people than it does on us. And a far worse effect on women and children worldwide too, because of the general situation that they're in. So there are plenty of moral reasons and plenty of inspiration, but I think the classical, well, Wendell Berry possibly, I think the classical, philosophical, morally inclined people who talk about the problem in terms of what we can do in our own minds and hearts are actually perhaps more important than the numbers. The numbers, though, are pretty easy to get. There are lots of groups coming out about how to save the world. Question is, are you going to do it? Yeah.
On that same theme, when Garrett Hardin wrote his
Yeah.
essay about the
Yeah.
tragedy of the commons, he said the solution was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And I think we do that a little bit, but how do we ramp that up as a society to do the things that you suggested at the end?
If you live on a block of upper middle class people and everybody has fancy cars, and you decide to have a less than fancy car, a conservative car, you'll find lots of mutual coercion, but it won't be in the direction of saving. It'll be in the direction of going upscale. It says you can afford a better car now or a better house or something. I think there's far more of that kind of coercion going on than there is of the other kind. And I think people have really got to come to believe it. I mean, they've got to come to realize that this is the context in which we're living, to accept that, and to become leaders and inspirers of one another, I think, rather than coercers. Because I don't think any number of figures or arguments, or it's getting hotter, we're all going to boil to death, or there's so many people, I don't think any of those are going to get people to stop driving their car around and doing whatever they're doing, because I'm busy tomorrow, so don't talk to me about the world coming to an end. Do you know the one about a woman came up after a lecture on cosmology and said, "Did you say that the solar system was going to exhaust its energy and burn out and the whole thing was going to be over in 10 million years?" He says, "No, madam, I said 10 billion years." She says, "Thank heavens, I thought you said 10 million years." Yeah.
As someone like from my generation, like when I talk to my friends or when I talk to a lot of people, they get really passionate about it and they'll really understand, you know, as soon as I'm talking to them, they know that there's something going on. But the problem is, as soon as that conversation is over, they forget about it or they move on. How, I don't want to like force things. Like I feel like nowadays, like every time I talk to someone, I'm trying to have a conversation with them about like what's going on, which is what needs to be happening. But then there are other people that are like, "Oh, you always talk about that. Like, why do you always talk about that?" And it's, well, because it's happening and we need to make a change. But how can we get more people talking about this without them feeling like it's being shoved down their throat, but it's something so, like, in your experience, what is the best way to talk to just the general, like, friends or someone who may not be in the major and appreciate it, or how do you talk to people?
Just say, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to choke you. No, I think it's persistence. You know, Francis of Assisi was converted at about the age of 22, and he died at about the age of 43, and there were 200,000 people in monasteries living according to the principles that he thought were important. Gandhi affected hundreds of millions of people in India and their welfare and everything else. You can be inspirational. Think of new ways of saying it. One kind of angle, there's two kind of angles I think about. One is, what can you do? Can you be a participant in a project that will get you somewhere, that will make things better? Like, can you be a participant in a project that's actually going to clean up your neighborhood or increase the biodiversity in your neighborhood, or find new ways for recycling in Raleigh, or, you know, whatever like that? Because then that's concrete. A less concrete but sort of congruent way of thinking about it would be, you say, what do you want Raleigh to look like in 20 years? Or what do you want the United States to be like in 20 years? And then you say, well, how do we get from A to B? And what are we doing that will make it not look like that in 20 years? I think the example of the seacoast is a very apt one, comparing Britain and the United States. Every community that's near the Atlantic coast of the United States is trying to push shopping malls down into the salt marshes. Well, it's insane, but we have no way of brokering that, and yet we're all insuring them. It's a sure way. I mean, talk about national debt. Holy smokes. And, of course, you could be political. You need to be political. But again, politicians are not going to act according to these things unless there are a good number of people who really believe them. You could go into a politician and say, I mean, most politicians, and say, statistics are clear that sea level is going to rise 4 feet in North Carolina in the next 70 years, 60 or 70 years, so it's bad to build down there, and storm will rise and all. And they will there'll be kind of two things. One is to accept that is so unpopular with their other constituents that they can't accept it. And the second thing politicians run into, there are only so many causes that they can pursue at a time, because every cause you pursue as a politician has a political cost for you, with your constituency, with the people you deal with the other people in the state legislature, with anybody. So you can only go for so many causes. So the thing that will really change your mind is by you're organizing enough people, I don't know where, in a church group, on the campus, wherever you want to organize it, and say, we really believe that it's important that this county take a lead in dealing with this problem, that the state deal with this problem, and that we find ways to help people to understand this problem. It has to be positive, and it has to be future oriented. I think it has to be action. People confronted with the kind of statistics I was just showing, which I was just kind of doing for background, they don't generally act. They freeze up and say, oh, freaking awful, I'm out of here. I think that's some here. Yeah.
I've been more of a people person and less of a plant person, but I've felt for a long time like it's really important to have a vision. The Bible says without a vision the people perish.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
And to get people to actually be able to visualize what it might look like to have a system that is balanced. And I'm thrilled to see younger people doing things like we could live in smaller houses. We could use public transportation.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people just can't imagine it any other way. And that's what I would love to see us do.
A lot of people don't think about it at all.
Yeah.
But I couldn't agree more that you have to have a vision. If you don't have a vision, you're cooked. I mean, we were just in Bhutan, and I was thinking of, Bhutan happens to be a very spiritual place, practically 100% Buddhist, and 750,000 people living in an area about a third the size of North Carolina. And they're between China and India, which are huge sucking countries, and yet they're still self-sufficient because their population is so low for the area. I thought of the song from South Pacific, Happy Talk, keep on talking happy talk. You got to have a dream. If you don't have a dream, how are you going to have a dream come true? I think that's real. I think that really is motivational. You could say, suppose, just take Asheville, since it's obviously beautiful and all. Well, suppose you're in Asheville and you say, gosh, this is beautiful. And say, well, I want this to look like this 30 years from now. Okay, what do we have to do to make this be like this 30 years from now? I think you can see a lot of things, keep the sign ordinances going, don't build more roads through pristine areas, keep the housing compact, energy efficient housing, certification, and all of that. Yeah.
So, what about when people who do care try to, establish things that help, like, for instance, palm oil plantations? They're trying to help, but at the same time, you're cutting down, tropic forests
Yeah.
for, you know, these plantations, and it's like you're helping, but, you know.
That goes to what I was talking about education and getting the facts in these cases. People argue that both ways. People argue GM crops in both ways. People argue a lot of things in both ways. And what you can do is try to get the facts and also be humble about it. Talk about things you'd like to do, as the song says. Talk about things that you can affect. You can affect better things here than you can palm oil plantations. It's a lot more difficult to get the facts about them. Your intuition is undoubtedly correct, but there are a lot of things you can do that are closer to home. That's why I stressed international understanding. If you knew a lot of people from Indonesia, if you'd been in Indonesia and lived there some years, if you'd been near places that were cleared to put in palm oil, you would have a first-hand impression of it and more of a view, more of a stake in it. But the only thing I'd say is getting the facts, educating yourself, and cultivate a worldwide view. As in every human endeavor, deal with things that are practical and attainable rather than things that are unattainable, like what am I going to say to the people in Indonesia? When you think about the position of the United States in everything that I just presented, it seems highly important to think about what are you going to say to yourself, first, because we're the biggest, by far the biggest. We have the highest human development index in the world, but since the average sustainable land in the world per person is about 2 hectares, the average amount of land that will regenerate itself, and we use about 12 for each person, it stands to reason that we can do a lot more here. Think about the 2 families that I showed. You can nag the people in West Africa to have fewer children or better sanitation or something, but if you understand them and try to help them, that'll be a lot better. And if you try to do things yourself where you are and where you live that are within your control, your family's control, your social group's control, you'll be making a huge difference. Japan uses 7 times as much land as sustainable capacity per person as exists in Japan. Think about what they could do by very simple things. China, on the other hand, uses very little per person, and yet we're always saying they emit more carbon dioxide than we do. I mean, both things are important, and making an agreement with them on global warming is surely important, but looking to ourselves is very, very good idea, and cultivating an international understanding view is very important. It may sound maudlin, but the important thing is for us to learn how to love one another all over the world, to live with one another, to care about one another, and to form a common vision about where we're going together, because it's really only that will change our minds enough to get us out of this, or to get out of it with the best results that we possibly can.
Let's do one more question.
Yeah.
But how much is it worth? Used to be that all insulin came from millions of pork.
The what?
Millions
All
of pork
Insulin.
insulin
Yeah.
came from pork pancreas and all of the livestock problems. When it came from pork, it was $3 a vial. Now it's all genetically engineered, and it's $15 or $20 a vial. The anti-cancer drugs that are $50,000 or $100,000 for a course of treatment. The money trees have already gone extinct, haven't they?
Money tree. Well, the two cases are kind of different. Insulin now is abundant and pure, which it never was before. There's never a way of getting enough, from cow pancreas. No, cow thyroids or pancreas. pig, whatever. You don't want anything from a pig. But it's now better and more abundant and all, so I think you can accept that and say, what's a just price for it? I mean, it's a serious, quite apart from anything else we've talked about, it's a serious moral problem. How much profit can a corporation make? How does it make it? Who gets the good of it? Do the poor get it who need it? What are we going to decide? But I think if you accepted the kind of principles I'm talking about, that would follow directly from that. 4 million people in the world have cell phones. What does that mean? 2 million of them have modern cell phones out of the 7 billion out of the 7 billion. That's shocking, isn't it? And the other thing was, I've forgotten.
Well,
You had two. You had insulin and
Cancer drugs.
oh, cancer drugs. Well, that I have no answer to. That's just I did cover that in a way. It's like, what are we going to pay for it, and who's going to pay for it, and we're not all going to live together, and what kind of philosophy, what kind of morality, what kind of principles are we going to adopt about it? What if you could keep people alive for another 10 years if you paid $1 million a year for each year you lived beyond the time that you were going to live? Well, you're not going to do it. Now, all of those things, though, I would point out, are made more difficult by having very large numbers of people putting huge pressure on the world than they would be if there were smaller numbers of people living in balance with the world.